Short Santayana, Dominions and Powers, Chapter 3, Ambiguity of Spirit in the Arts. There is a sense in which life and reason may be said to vivify the arts, but this sense is recondite and remote from the conceit and rashness with which people speak of the spirit in history or reason in the universe. It is not at all true that, as Virgil says, mind agitates a lump of formless matter and mixes itself with the vast body of nature. Mind would have to become matter before it could do that. Nor is it true even in the human fine arts or in eloquence that there is a previous purely mental image that the sculptor's hand or the speaker's words retrace when they are inspired. A deliberate speaker may, in conversation or argument, think of what he will say before he says it, but that thought is itself a form of words coming spontaneously into his mind by gift of his unforeseen vital fertility. The physical agitation issuing in that inspiration is felt strongly in the body and noticed by the listener. Were that total bodily action wanting, there would be no true eloquence, but only the cold recitation of a phrase not then being bred in the man's heart. The good actor must train his pose and features to imitate the gesture of all the passions, so as to seem to feel them. Whether he feels them a little or not is immaterial. Similarly, the marble block contains all possible geometrical forms in its pure extension, but only passively and without discrimination, and without predisposition of any sort in favor of any one of them. It is the psyche in the artist producing all sorts of specific stresses and modifications among the physical impressions it receives that guides the hand in quite abstractly hitting upon or fantastically evoking them, and evoking at the same time, and even before, a new evanescent image in the mind. With this dream image, the artist will find it difficult to define, retain, or reproduce in his work what his hand or his verbal imagination, if he is a poet, supplies spontaneously, will form the real starting point and first guide in his inspiration. Round it, his expert art may then arrange and rearrange other elements, suggesting themselves spontaneously or habitually until he has composed a satisfying total design, if ever he succeeds in doing so. This complex and tentative labor of the psyche Michelangelo attributes to the intellect, following Platonic tradition, but this intellect was conceived mythologically as a divine and unchanging life, a pure ideal of the contemplative ecstasy that the artist himself would attain if he could perfect his every intuition and hold it unclouded for all eternity. This ultimate vision of the spirit is not essentially ultimate in time, as if art began with making tools and ended with pure music or religious ecstasy. Spirit, insofar as it is spirit, is pure from the beginning, and the sense of precision and triumph that may escape from a blow well struck or a dance well danced is like the widow's mite in the life of spirit, an obscure and forgotten virtue peeping for a moment out of the tangle of animal misery and greed. So the rudest primitive arts, like the elementary passions, throw out glints and sparks of vital liberty, glorying in something well done, and the perfection of action, dominating matter, realizes the good and the beautiful at every stage. The useful does not possess these virtues for being useful, but the art of devising and executing useful works has a vital virtue of its own, which sheds a modest and healthful brightness and beauty over those works, not for their utility, but for their intrinsic order, as if they were new tribes of animals come by magic to people the magnetic field of the human will. Chapter 4. The Ethos of Agriculture. At the root of agriculture, we have placed hunger and the avid, absolute, stubborn will, not only to devour, but to gather, hold, and guard everything devourable. Such, I think, is the primary impulse that supports all the civilizing and civilized attachment to property. That the most brutal of instincts should be the source of all civilization will not seem to be a paradox to anyone who understands what life is. This impulse never ceases to be brutal in itself, but 1,000 circumlocutions are imposed on it in action, and 1,000 refinements of perception and feeling arise in the development of subsidiary organs capable of serving it. Each of these useful organs has a free and liberal life of its own. It does not exist in order to be useful, but if it has not proved cooperative and friendly to the total organism in which it lives, it would not have been propagated with it as an essential part, but would have dropped out or subsisted only as a burden and a parasite. So the eye and the mechanism that draws the eye to anything bright or moving enable an animal to place and to pursue his prey at a distance. But before doing so, the eye must have grown sensitive to physical light, and its inner life, with its cerebral connections, will, under the ethereal stimulus, evoke the divine sensation of light, with all the charming variety of colors and the mathematical and aesthetic infinitude of geometrical forms. Greed, in this way, enacted at first only by a rudimentary mouth and stomach, and the worm breeds within and puts forth beyond the skin an endlessly elaborate system of instruments, all internally alive, with each a function and perhaps a joy of its own. The first layer of such outworks is bodily. The second layer is detached materially, but in its use and in its form, essentially a servant of its master and moved by its master's hand. Then, immaterial in essence and ideal in status, a third layer is formed of images and of moral relations, all deployed and warmed by the central power station of the human psyche, from which they draw their meaning, and which in turn they enrich with all kinds of sensuous excitements and ideal possessions. Agriculture displays this process from the bottom to the top more clearly than the other arts, because its first steps are the most humble and its last lessons the most certain and sublime. It begins and ends close to nature. It does not allow its derivatives or refinements to seem independent, uncontrolled, or arbitrary. It must always continue to plow the earth, to sow the seed, to watch the harvest ripen precariously according to the weather. The farmer's eyes watch the clouds no less anxiously than the fields. His motive is not stargazing, yet he learns to distinguish the stars and their movements. He knows how far the conditions of his existence stretch beyond his power of doing anything to control them, and yet his conviction is complete and constantly verified regarding the fruits of his own intelligence, fidelity, and labor. He rises eagerly at dawn, he works all day, and fatigue and food make him heavy and dull in the evening. He remains all his life half stupefied by the monotony and limitation of his life. Clever town people think him a dunce, yet his philosophy, with its old proverbs, is sound and comprehensive. He knows the need and justification of both materialism and religion, and their perfect agreement. As for their expression in words, he leaves that to old priests and to young lovers. It was beside the rural hearth, in rural feasts, and by a rustic altar that sound human morals and religion took definite shape. Duties were clearly imposed by the conditions of life, by the precise natural structure of a society composed of a patriarchal family with its sons, daughters, and servants, all engaged in the traditional service of one household, with no government or institution dominating it, yet running over into kindred households, forming a village, or scattered over the countryside. All these were bound together by common dangers and misfortunes, blood bonds and blood feuds, in which maxims and standards of fidelity, mutual assistance, and condign punishments were traditional, rooted in the land and in sacred obligations. The mind became conservative with a double strength and wisdom, since its first principles were borrowed from necessity and at the same time formed a solid nucleus for experience and experiment to weave round that center a congruous web of law firmly clinging to the earth by its roots, yet plastic to the winds and the seasons and its branches. Wisdom was fear of the Lord, respect for the conditions of health and prosperity, and with this Lord, the people have made a covenant which would govern their destiny according to their fidelity to it or their disloyalty. Every society, however, has its Esau to snap his fingers at home life and at the thrifty Jacob, and even without a positive succession, the wilder son will take to adventure and hunting, and if the love of wealth and domination is not extinct in him, he may learn to train animals, to breed, and to domesticate them. I have said something about this from the point of view of the tamed animals in the chapter about slavery. Here it remains to consider the qualities generated in the tamer, breeder, and driver. About the ethos of shepherds, I have also said something in the same place. Commonly, the shepherd, even if he has his hut and his nightly bonfire on the mountainside, is only an emissary and an outpost of a patriarchal farm, more distinct and tending to migration, militancy, and conquest. Is the nomad master of cattle, horses, or camels. He prefers the tent or the wagon to the house. He has no temple or shrine, other than perhaps some great stone or mountain that is a landmark for him in the wilderness. And his way of life is possible only in a thinly populated region of desert and sterile plain, where his herds must continually change their pasturage, and from which he is tempted often to braid the fertile lands on his borders. Far-sighted, silent, masterful, and abstemious, he appreciates and values in himself the virtues of his mounts: strength, steadiness, sureness, endurance, and swiftness. He is not bored at long days of solitude or nights under the stars. His thoughts and his songs, for he sings and versifies, are monotonous, but pregnant and terse, and his passions, when occasion occurs to excite or to indulge them, are intense, absolute, jealous, and cruel. Such, at least, is the Asiatic and African type of nomad. But in the north, the breeders or hunters of animals and the seamen form a different species within the same genus of the primitive dominant man, expert, meditative, and independent. But in the north, he is more in need of copious food and drink, with a nebulous intellect and sentimental melancholy or jovial moods. Strains of these kinds often reappear in stray individuals in the most highly civilized circles in northern countries, and whole classes, like the British gentry and the American rich, show marked preference for the country over the town, not only for sport, but for residence and companionship, as if immersion in society, which they probably think a duty as well as a necessity, wearied the inner man, and they felt an atavistic longing for solitude and the wilds. Their interest in animals, from being sportive, often becomes tender and scientific. They could never have made gods of them, like the dramatic ancients. Their gods are vague spirits flowing within them, or perhaps through all nature into new worlds. But there is the same resistance as in Eastern nomads to civilizing trammels, material or moral, and there is also a comfortless need of profound internal changes, not change merely playful on the surface, as if nature had no fundamental structure, no growth by accretion and fulfillment in perfections of every kind, but rather a radical indecision and instability, flying from any acquired form as from a prison or a deadly temptation. Arts in these persons have been only a concession to the exigencies of matter, which will hold together and serve a specific purpose only if molded on definite lines. But there has not been a corresponding articulation in a healthy psyche, fixing its particular goals of progress. Economic arts here have therefore always remained servile and ugly, never becoming liberal arts as well, or if in the elaboration of needlework or of grotesque sculpture, the liberal impulse plays about an essentially useful or superstitious practice. The aesthetic element seems never to be separated in the peasant mind from pride in possessing something rich and costly, or pious respect for something numinous. And it has seemed to me, in casual contact with country people, especially in Spain, that the best of their wise proverbs and their enthralling monotonous songs was not wholly native to the soil, but an echo of ancient wailings, Arabian or gypsy, or perhaps ecclesiastical, now adapted to popular taste and to amateur execution. Yet this execution, though unequal, often betrayed the nostalgia of an artistic spirit for the purest tone and the most complex harmony. Such cries, though they may escape the soul anywhere, are not to be attributed to the ethos of agriculture in its practical soundness and hardness. To the rustic, religion speaks of safety. Song and dance speak of war or of frisky love, and where there is competition in skill, it is also a competition in courtship. To an agricultural people, mountains and rocks seem horrible, and a beautiful landscape must contain fruit trees, well watered meadows, and some convenient crops in the backyard. When a vocation to some free art arises, as it may, in the milieu, the young man leaves his plough in the field as the apostles left their nets by the shore and accepts the exile and the poverty that face the poet. Chapter 5. Domestic Morality. Reproduction, like nutrition, is indispensable to an animal race. The economy of sex is therefore no less important in life than the provision of food. The sexual impulse must be strong enough at certain seasons to abolish a more prudential selfishness, and special habits and sentiments must be so rooted in the psyches of parents that their offspring may not perish. This, in man, is a serious commitment, whereas in some other species, everything is made ready in the young before birth or very soon after, so that parenthood is not a serious interruption of hunting or migrating or fresh love affairs. The prolonged childhood of the human race, on the contrary, demands disinterested and probably unrewarded devotion to the young, at least on the mother's part. But the birth of more children before the first is weaned fetters the spontaneous affection of the father also to his nest and to his wife. This is the basis of human domestic morality. Leaving aside the alternative between monogamy and polygamy, an alternative decided by ulterior political conditions rather than by the exigencies of reproduction itself. We may consider the home from the point of view of the child. He begins by being helpless, but not willless, a truly unhappy condition. Yet, one of the most beautiful harmonies that can arise in nature or in social life comes to his rescue in this plight. The mother, and in some degree, the father also, possess a strong instinct and a heroic determination to look after that child. She supplies him with the milk suitably provided by nature, while protecting him from mishaps, carrying him with her wherever she goes, and helping him to learn to behave as will prove most agreeable and advantageous for him. This impulse in one person to do for another whatever this other person needs but cannot do for himself, to divine and to share his secret wishes and to satisfy them more wisely than he would have done in his inexperience and clumsiness. This is motherly love, and is like charity in quality, but not in scope. Natural brotherly love is not charity at all, for brothers, while better companions, as a rule, than a parent and a child in play and in adventure, are not naturally sympathetic or self sacrificing, but rather jealous and fault finding under slight provocation. And this is natural because they are rivals. It is when not rivals because of decidedly different ages or temperaments that the elder may show a fatherly or protective tenderness towards the younger, who will correspond with canine worship and admiration. But this belongs to friendship and the love of the free for the free, rather than to domestic morals. The lucubrations of Freud about incestuous instincts in infants are of no political moment. Sensual vices can be grafted artificially upon the very young by persons of either sex or any age who are already vicious. But while, as mere sensuality, the effect may survive throughout the victim's life, this sensuality will be diffuse and not concentrated on any person or class of persons. It will not prevent fancy and passion from choosing its normal objects after puberty, and it may provoke in timid or very haughty tempers an angry rebuttal of all unsolicited love. Jealousy, on the contrary, provokes murderous impulses towards all rivals, as if they were guilty of insults or theft, which may not be at all the case, and the crimes of jealousy are more often prompted by ambition or offended pride than by infidelity in love. It is when love has become proprietorship and dominion, as in Bluebeards and domestic tyrants, that husbands kill adulterous wives and lovers. This is social vengeance, according to a militant code of honor. When a young lover who has yet no conventional rights over his sweetheart or mistress finds her unfaithful, sadness, rather than rage, possesses him. It is not his honor, but his conceit or his hope that is morally wounded. And if he kills anybody, it may be himself, for he feels humbled rather than outraged. The pre established harmony between the mother's instinct and the child's wants is less perfect in man than in some other mammals, because it is less automatic at first and more crossed later by other cares in the mother and by caprice and dangerous gropings in the child. The mother has to undertake to correct as well as to nurse or carry, and an education that is not carried on by example and instinctive imitation, as is education in speech, soon becomes a nuisance, both to teacher and pupil. A fundamental sense of union and confidence usually remains, but crossed daily by little episodes of irritation, severe looks, accents, and tears. The specter of authority appears behind each human individual that exercises it, and turns him or her into a natural enemy. Only a very timid, submissive, and still vague will can shape itself exactly according to prescription, and never feel any conflict between service and freedom. The family and every other form of society would be slavery, but for the suave influence of imitation and custom. Everybody does this. Nobody does that. Become the most imperative, yet the most acceptable of guides to action. You are checked, thwarted, and harnessed, but you are made safe. Soon you will be proud of your livery, intolerant of any other habit, and ready to die for the red rose or the white. Prosperous growth in a family or tribe is not what it might be in a flock of sheep. Sheep in a luscious pasture, free from shepherds and wolves, would simply multiply, or if some variation appeared in the species, it would be only towards greater size and thicker fleeces. All the sheep would get fatter, the rams stronger, the ewes softer, the milk thicker, and the lambs more frisky. The family of a merchant, suddenly grown rich, might develop among us on similar lines. But I am considering how the primitive family could grow into a more complex moral and political organism, not how it might later altogether dissolve. The primitive human family, even if it lived in the Garden of Eden, would set to work at once to choose a particularly good place for a nest, would spread a soft and sheltered couch, clear a space for a hearth, and dig a hole to be covered with a flat stone for a treasure house and a pantry. Having prehensile hands and agile legs, the young males would soon begin to forage. They would prefer climbing hills and trees, swimming in rivers, and chasing animals, to squatting idle at home. The young women would vie with one another in weaving aprons and arranging feathers, each hoping to make herself more conspicuous than her sisters or her neighbors. While civilization thus dawned at home, the young men, in good weather, for even Eden must have wet seasons, would perhaps silently disperse, one taking to the woods, another to the seashore, both possibly to be lost forever, or to return late, sullen and wounded, full of secret knowledge and hidden plans. Next year, perhaps, a girl from another tribe would come back with one of them, carrying a child in her arms. Soon, the family would become numerous and divided into smaller families. Besides daughters in law and grandchildren, the patriarch might have captives or refugees become his servants, for even among primitive, scattered, and domestic populations, there will be wars, and in wars, prisoners are often the most valuable spoils. These wars may be provoked by militant hordes living by pillage, but they may also arise automatically and unintentionally between peaceful neighbors. For if the land is fertile, it will soon be overpopulated. Families will encroach upon one another or migrate, and it will be hard in either case to avoid conflicts and feuds. In the jungle, there was already a constant, silent war of plants upon one another, and of animals on plants, not prompted by militancy, but imposed by rivalry and growth, and a living creature cannot be reproached for being alive. Even the religion of charity, which represents the ultimate dictates of experience, wisdom, and sympathy, teaches that the starving have a natural right to seize their part of another's food, which it is a duty to surrender to them. This is feasible and morally satisfying in particular cases, and incidentally, but nature cannot allow all her species or races to waste away so that they may share the same fate. Starvation is not naturally a contagious cause of death, but a cause of selection by eliminating the weakest or most passive. Therefore, the struggle for life never terminates by the extermination of all and inevitable war among lovers of peace, though incidentally it encourages militancy in a part of the people. It is not itself a sign of militancy, but only of some contrariety encountered in innocent growth. A society based on the family, for instance, the Roman, can be strong in war and constant in it because its military frontiers, where it runs up against the uncivilized world, are simply the fringe of its moral domestic economy. Rome incorporated what it conquered, and this might have been the beginning of a universal and permanent organization of mankind according to the generative order of nature, without any intrinsic militancy or willful tyranny. But Rome had met, as its vital economy expanded, races more maturely civilized than itself, which succumbed to its government but retained their own ethos, individual and cynical, or individual and mystical, or tribal and militant. All these foreign influences crossed Roman tradition and contributed, with the temptations of wealth and power, to relax Roman virtue at home, as well as to prevent it from taking root abroad. There are porcupines and armadillos that have become terribly hostile and overloaded in attempting to defend an innocent life against fate, and they sink under the weight and the drain of their defenses. Had promiscuity and the herd instinct universally established themselves in the human race, the family might have been reduced to an early episode of no political importance in the perilous emergence of one generation out of another. Infants must have had nurses, not necessarily their mothers, to give them the breast, or, in civilized times, the bottle. As soon as children could walk and eat, they would have flocked, played, and quarreled in troops according to their ages, and in troops they would have been drilled afterwards in whatever arts the government thought proper. This simple regimen, which nature has somehow overlooked, might still be introduced artificially by radical communism, such as Plato proposed. Such a society would obviate all the lifelong dominations and jealousies, as well as the lifelong affections that family life involves. It would also abolish all hereditary classes or possessions, retaining only those necessarily formed by membership in particular trades, arts, or sciences, and by the relative proficiency and authority attained in them. We, with our diversified society, can hardly imagine the interests and the passions that would then agitate the human heart. Would these be only irresistible, unanimous, gregarious sentiments? Or would the serried ranks of those disciplined multitudes, like sea waves or desert sands, excite only a greater sense of solitude and a greater spiritual liberty in the private mind? In any case, the family, as we know it, is a conventionalized political institution, not a social necessity. A consequence of this is that the family has various degrees of extent and cohesion. It involves different, even contrary, standards of virtue. It once had a political authority, which it has largely lost, but the bond which at each stage has held it together has always been the same: economic interdependence. The patriarch was a monarch so long as he held all the property of all his descendants and servants and controlled their pursuits, marriages, and friendships. When, on the contrary, the sons began to earn their own living and the daughters to choose their own husbands, when nobody expects any important inheritance, and when all the children have been educated in public or boarding schools with books, friends, and ideas perhaps unknown to their parents, the kingdom and the power have passed from the patriarch and his traditional family monarchy to the authority of the social world, its fashions and opinions. A little sentiment fed on consecrated phrases and on childish impressions may still add a little glamour to the idea of family and home and control their pursuits. But the heart, the mind, the pride of life, and the standard of morals are now rooted elsewhere. Thus, the family and the monarchical order of society growing out of it, the greatest social and moral triumph of simple nature, proves to have been only an insecure and imperfect triumph. That regimen which seemed to harmonize all duties, interests, and affections is a noble and varied unity, natural and lasting, dissolves as spontaneously as it grew. The morality that it required was too social for the will in the living individual and too domestic for its intellect.